Thank you so much. I'm mostly not speaking in this session. It's largely Ruth, but I will just give two plugs. First of all, if you happen to be in Bangalore tomorrow, Ruth and I are giving a second session, quite different from this one, at the Bangalore International Centre, where there will actually be a piano on stage as well, so I will be putting in musical interludes. And of course, my second plug is, if you want to hear my amazing rock band, go find us. We're called The Connoisseur, and our amazing debut album is called Cryogenic Man. Now, enough of that, and over to Beethoven and to you, Ruth.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming. And what a lovely session it was just before as well. I mean, this whole two days has been a kind of carnival of, as far as I'm concerned, poetry leading, poetry selling, poetry wonderful. So thank you very much for coming. And we're going to what we are going to do, we're going to go through Beethoven's life, and I'm going to give you some slides, just a few, because he was a rock star in his own time. Can you hear me at the back? Is that all right? Yeah? Okay. He was so famous in his own time, and there are so many images of him, so many memories of him, memoirs of him, stories about him, a lot of them maybe not quite true. And so my book is a kind of series of snapshots through his life in poems, and behind the poems, notes on them which become a kind of mini biography. So I think it's probably the smallest biography of Beethoven there is. So we're going to start. Thank you. This is his birthplace, as it was about 100 years later. He was born in 1770, and his father was a musician, not a very good musician, and they lived in Bonn, which was an outpost then. It's in Germany now, but it was then an outpost of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And thank you, yes. So they moved from that place when he was quite young, and then they lived I went there, it's a little cul-de-sac, it's destroyed now, the house, but at the end of the street was the Rhine, and that was his formative time. And just keep it there for a second, because I'm going to read a poem about his father. So his father was, as I said, not a very good musician, not very successful. His father was a much more successful musician, and I think the poor old father in the middle got a bit lost, and he drank. If your father damaged you, the way meteorites spin in, clustering on Antarctic ice, bare shields of glacier burnished by ferocious wind, because your father is magnetite, dragging all the iron in your soul into his own force field. You seal yourself in. You need nothing but music. Your answer to obstruction will be fire. In the little hall of the house where you were born, the one original surface is dark silver flagstones where you might have crawled, where I imagine your mother carrying the shopping, your father staggering home drunk up those stairs, to wake you in the middle of the night, stand you for hours on a bench so you can reach the keys. You cry as you play, slapped if you make a mistake. In daylight, he hears you improvise, splashing around, he calls it, on a violin. What rubbish are you scratching now? Isn't that beautiful? No, you made it up. You're not to do that. Stop, or I'll box your ears. If your father damaged you, the way fierce winds scour glacier ice where meteorites have fallen from heaven. But he was the one who made you, beat the notes into you on the clavier, viola, violin. Your response to challenge ever after will be attack. You will need no one. only the relationship of sound and key. You improvise. And anyway, in my book, that quality of the relationship with his father has, dominated his character. And I think in that story about the father threatening to box his ears while he was improvising is so interesting, whether it was true or not. Because for one thing, of course, his ears became one of the sort of other dominating features of his life. And for the other, so did improvising. And he then, after this at 16 and then again at 20, he went to Vienna, never looked back. And that was where he made his name. And he made his name in improvising. Karl, over to you in improvising.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see his improvisation today just occasionally in, for instance, the variation sets, because you can almost sense him improvising and then writing it down, and a couple of the fantasias and the fantasy. And if you know the choral fantasy at all, which is from a bit later, we think that the piano written out version is pretty much his improvisation, because at the first performance, he hadn't had a chance to compose the opening, and so he literally just improvised it. But I do have a contemporaneous account of what it was like to be in the room with Beethoven improvising. In his improvisations, even then, Beethoven did not deny his tendency towards the mysterious and the gloomy. When once he began to revel in the infinite world of tones, he was transported. Also above all earthly things, his spirit had burst all restricting bounds, shaken off the yoke of servitude, and soared triumphantly and jubilantly into the luminous spaces of the higher ether. Now his playing tore along like a wildly foaming cataract, and the conjurer constrained his instrument to an utterance so forceful that the stoutest structure was scarcely able to withstand it. And anon he sank down, exhausted, exhaling gently plaints, dissolving in melancholy. Again, the spirit would soar aloft, triumphing over transitory terrestrial sufferings, turn its glance upward in reverent sounds, and find rest and comfort on the innocent bosom of holy nature. But who shall sound the depths of the sea? Isn't that fabulous?
So wonderful, thank you. They had at that time improvising contests, and so it was competitive improvising. It was there were no at that point public concerts in Vienna. They were nearly all private halls in sort of rich people's homes. And you went along there, and there were 2 or 3 famous pianists, and they were pitted against each other. So one person would improvise away, and then another one would improvise afterwards. And everybody laughed at Beethoven. He was short, he was ugly, he didn't know how to dress, he was from Germany, he had a funny accent, he had hairs on the back of his hands. Everybody laughed at him. But they didn't laugh at him when he played, and he just knocked spots off all the top improvising pianists in Vienna. So, next slide, please.
I mean, the famous one is, of course, Daniel Steibelt, who was a bit of a charlatan. And Beethoven got so bored with Steibelt's music, he turned his piece that he just played upside down on the music stand, picked out the tune backwards and upside down, and then improvised on it. At which point, Daniel Steibelt left the room. But more than that, he made sure for the rest of his life he was never in the same city as Beethoven, because he never wanted that to happen to him again. So that's how amazing that kind of, he just wiped the floor. And Steibelt had been a very important pianist up until that time, albeit somewhat of a character, I suppose.
Here he is when he's 30. So he's been in Vienna for 10 years. He's had lessons with Haydn, the great composer. He's beginning to compose. And he's rolling along. Girls ask for his signature. But something terrible is happening to his ears. It's probably a bit of tinnitus. He doesn't know what's happening. He goes on, but he doesn't want anybody to know. Here he is, he's a stranger in Vienna, and he's making his name as a musician, and nobody must know that he has problems with his ears. Next slide, please. Okay, yeah. So he is writing one of the most famous early piano sonatas, which is now called the Moonlight Sonata. And in this sonata, I'm going to ask Karl to talk about it in a minute. I'm sure you've heard the Moonlight Sonata, but it is. Maybe I'll just read a poem about it so that you can hear. He is writing this just as he is going deaf, or just he's beginning to realize that something is terribly, terribly wrong. Moonlight Sonata. We make the life we need. The city's bells are muffled. The sky is frozen copper. You still can hear sometimes. You still win the improvising contests. A sonata in C-sharp minor, quasi fantasia, like a blind girl lit by moonlight she cannot see. New melodies unfold from tiny seeds, euphoria, then presto agitato, manic rage. The music of loss, of losing, bass clef, high treble only once and in despair, then the new shocked calm of, is it true? Is this what it sounds like going deaf? Karl, what do you feel when you play the Moonlight Sonata? You must have played it a million times.
It's, of course, it's an extraordinary moment in music and piano history. This is the first time that someone has really experimented with a form that's been very nicely set up. We've got the piano sonata. It's pretty much been established by Haydn. Everybody knows how it goes. Beethoven's first piano sonatas are really expanding the form, but very strict. And in fact, about two sonatas before this, the Opus 22 Sonata in B-flat is probably the high point of what we call the Viennese kind of classicism. And we've got to that, and he's proved he can absolutely do it. And then he starts experimenting. And what do we have with the Moonlight Sonata? We have, first of all, a sonata that starts with a slow movement. I mean, it's almost like he's forgotten to put the first movement on, and that's already extraordinary. Then we were talking, of course, about improvising, and we will do right through the session. He calls it sonata quasi una fantasia. A fantasia was something you improvised. You went through lots of moods. It wasn't something constrained. It wasn't something held down by rules and forms, which a traditional sonata is. So the idea that he's saying, well, it's kind of a sonata, but it's also a fantasia. It goes through lots of different qualities and moods, particularly the first movement, is really extraordinary. And then, on top of that, the pedal marking. Now, we've had pedal markings since 1793, 1794. In fact, Daniel Steibelt was the first pedal marking, as it happens, in 1793. But Beethoven says, well, actually, I'm going to put the pedal down right through the first movement to give this really eerie, ethereal, dark, gloomy, possibly moonlight through clouds, whatever. Of course, it's not his title for the sonata. And that, again, is extraordinarily experimental with this rapidly developing new piano. And he's testing it to its limits in the first movement by seeing what this pedal will do and the sounds and tones that will come out of it. And then in the last movement, with, as Ruth says, this kind of rage at the piano, that that piano could barely survive. And it's well known that Beethoven often used to break hammers because the pianos were not big enough for his vision of the sounds he wanted to create at them. And literally the hammers would break mid-concert and strings would break. And there was something extraordinarily visceral about Beethoven's playing of this kind of music.
So you can also see that here he is at a kind of critical agony about his professional life. He knew he was a genius from very early on. He just knew. And so he knew he had all that, something extraordinary within him. And at this point in his life, what does he do with it? He experiments, he innovates formally in the most extraordinary, confident way. So next slide, please. So this is the moment at which it's a personal trauma of going deaf, but it is also a musical change. So we will go on to the musical change now. Next slide, please. And he's getting more and more worried about his ears. He tries ridiculous, doctors tell him to do awful things, to, drink, have a bath in warm Danube water. Big deal. Or one doctor even prescribed binding poisonous bark around his upper shoulders for a week. So it raised blisters, which the doctor then lanced, because all the pus coming out, he said, was blocking his ears. Beethoven knew this wouldn't work. He knew they were, but he didn't know what to do. But then one person sensibly said, why don't you leave Vienna for 6 months and go to a nice country village and rest your ears? Because Vienna must have been very noisy. Clatter, clatter, clatter of horses' hooves and things over the cobbles the whole time. The streets were very narrow, most of them. So off he went to a little village called Heiligenstadt, which is now at the end of a tram line. It's a Vienna suburb. And he lived in a bakery. So there's the bakery. Next slide, please. And he went in May. And at first he thought it was nice, and he wrote a lot. And then one day he was walking in the woods with a friend who came to visit him. And the friend said, oh, listen, there's a shepherd playing a flute. And Beethoven couldn't hear it. And the friend, seeing his crestfallen face, said, oh, no, stop now. And Beethoven knew he was lying. And as the months went on, and as the spring and the vineyards turned to autumn and the leaves came off the trees, he thought of suicide. And he wrote on the 6th of October the most extraordinary, it was a letter. It was couched to his two brothers, his two younger brothers, who he did not really get on with. But it was a sort of letter of where I am now. And this next poem is from a little bit of it. And he says in this letter, "Oh, you men who think or say I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic," because he had been avoiding people, because he didn't want them to know he was deaf, and because he couldn't hear them. "How grossly you wrong me! You do not know the secret cause which makes me seem that way. For 6 years I have been hopelessly afflicted, made worse by senseless physicians, from year to year deceived with hopes of improvement. I must face this is forever, doomed to loneliness, deficient in the one sense which should be more perfect in me than anyone. I would have put an end. Only my art. Impossible to leave the world until I have composed all I feel compelled to make. So I endure, wretched, until it please the fates to break the thread." So that's what he wrote, and that's at the end of that writing. He never sent it. It was found in his writing desk after he died. Until it break the fates, until it please the fates to break the thread. 5 full moons, 5 waning moons, touches of chill in the autumn night, dying vine leaves, purple as the pulse vein in his wrist, the woods yellow, then black and bare. The candle trembles in a draught, shutters swing in silence, like the sea breathing through glass. He cannot hear the driving rain, but he's sketching a funeral march, a symphony. I have taken a new path. Next slide, please. Well, this new path is the Eroica Symphony, the 3rd symphony, which is his breakthrough into a new writing phase, which we call the heroic style. And he dedicated it to Napoleon. Now, he was very taken with Napoleon because he saw him as a man of the people, which Beethoven felt he was from a lowly beginning. So he was, the heroism, and the whole next 10 years of his life are dominated by a sense of the hero in man. He was very, very keen on man and the spirit, the human spirit. But then when Napoleon accepted the title of emperor, Beethoven was horrified. He said he is just like other men, he's just out for himself. And so he scored out, and that's the manuscript where you can see the scratch. He tore the paper, scratching out the Eroica Symphony. Do you want to say anything about the heroic phase?
Oh, no, absolutely. And I mean, much bigger than even just Beethoven and music at this point. Really, Beethoven is the first person we say, genius, at the time. Before that, musicians are craftsmen. They turn out this many symphonies or that length of cantata or whatever for their employers. Mozart complains that in Salzburg he's somewhere under the second footman in the order of the servants in the house. And suddenly we have Beethoven. He has his own stipend, and in his very, very famous argument with Count Lichnowsky, sorry, am I adumbrated? Fine. Fine, good. He has this huge argument with Count Lichnowsky, storms off and basically says, just remember. Oh, can I not do that one yet?
No.
Fine.
We'll do that in its place.
Fine, I'm ahead of time. So in this sense, he is a self-made man other than rather than a craftsman. He is taking center stage. And in that sense, there's a kind of personal heroism. And then that absolutely flows out into the musical genres, whether it's the symphonies or the sonatas or many other genres at this time, because he breaks the bounds and he creates a musical drive, a force that really sweeps us along with it. And this is really, I think we can say, the first properly concert music. Music meant to take a listener on a huge journey and undermine them and indeed build them up during the course of that listening. That's a new idea.
So this symphony, the Eroica Symphony, I think I'll read a poem about that, because when I was doing this, I wanted to get a lot of sort of critical musicological judgments about what exactly he's doing. And the innovation is at every point in this symphony. It is in the harmonies, in how he uses the different sections, and in the structure and in the spirit of it. But it's also his coming out of the underworld. He's gone down into the underworld when he thought he was going to kill himself. And instead of that, he wrote this symphony, Eroica. All night, I've been thinking of you, careening down to the underworld. And now, with the resilience of a dervish, you rage back up from the depths and get a job as composer in a theatre. The man you hoped to be is disappearing into the horizon like a creature of sea ice. But you are fire dust, gold flight, winching upwards into pure light. Napoleon the Liberator, conqueror of the Alps. Battles are being won, smashing windows all over the city, making old Vienna and the Habsburg Empire look like a study of life on the ocean floor, while you drive forward into a new world dawn thrilling with dissonance, calling up wild steel angels no one has ever met before, looking down on volutes of the foyer as on a dying fire. You are havoc on the brink, a jackhammer shattering the night, soaring past world sorrow, against everything that can happen to you or anyone. You pitch, experiment, and the next new key, ever more remote. So at this time, next slide, please. Thank you. At this time also, he is in love. Now, one of his earliest friends from Bonn said Beethoven was always in love and took it very hard every time. And this was possibly the woman he was in love with for longest. She's she was married several times, and I have got here a long poem which it's too long to read you now, but she had quite a life herself, and she was a countess, so she couldn't marry Beethoven even if she'd wanted to, because her children, whom she had by a previous count, would be disinherited from the aristocracy. So meanwhile, so that was going badly, and there are sort of heart-rending letters, sort of letters that it's embarrassing that you can read them online now. Because, I mean, it's awful to be old, to be famous and dead, and to have written love letters, because they're all online. You know, the most vulnerable things. I mean, I was embarrassed to read them. You know, he's saying, "Oh, are you locking me out? Why are you locking me out?" Have you ever read those letters?
Yeah. Yeah, they're extraordinary. I suppose in modern times we're just as prone to that. They'll publish our WhatsApps or something. But, you know, it'll be terrible in every way. At least in those days you could burn your letters or give them back or something. It's a very difficult business.
Okay, next slide, please. So this is the moment which Karl was referring to. So just a moment of going back to man of the people stuff. He had no money. He was dependent on publishers, and publishers always have been, you know, difficult paymasters for the writers and composers, but he was most dependent on patrons, and this was the system up to really throughout until the sort of late 19th century. You had Count Lichnowsky. Next slide, please. There, and you can see this haughty, rich, and little Beethoven. But Beethoven had his music. And so in the summer of 1806, when Josephine had absolutely closed the door on him, and also one of his younger brothers had a son, and he was very jealous of that, because none of his love affairs ever went anywhere. He was always in love with aristocratic women who were always out of his reach. And, you know, he didn't seem to be very he was getting to be famous, but he wasn't very attractive, it seemed. He didn't dress well, but he had a kind of magnetism and fire. But anyway, he was rather despondent, so Count Lichnowsky invited him to his country house, which you saw in the previous slide. And this was at a period of time when Napoleon and his forces were occupying Vienna and the surrounding countryside. And so they were the French. They were occupants. They were occupiers. And Lichnowsky made the great mistake of inviting a whole lot of French officers to dine in his grand castle, and said, "Oh, Beethoven will play for you." Over to Karl. Okay, I'll carry on. So Beethoven nearly threw a chair at the Count. He had to be, luckily, there was another Count there who stopped him. And he stormed out, he stormed up to his room, he packed all his manuscripts, including the only manuscript of the Appassionata Sonata and the Opus 59 string quartets, put them in his case, and stomped off 7 miles through a storm down to the station, getting sort of very ill in the process. And when he got back to Vienna, he dashed to pieces a plaster statue, a bust of Count Lichnowsky, which the Count had strangely enough given him. What sort of gift is that you give somebody a plaster bust of yourself? Anyway, he broke it to pieces, and he said...
Well, he said, first of all, that what the Count was, he was by dint of breeding and his family, but what Beethoven was, he was by dint of himself. And then he goes on to say, there will be many thousands of princes. There will only ever be one Beethoven.
And after it's, but he did lose the stipend.
But worth it, surely, for an independent artist. Semi.
Next slide, please. So he tried one more young girl. She was not an aristocrat, this one. She was the daughter of a rich a rich merchant, and her name was Therese Malfatti. She was actually some sort of cousin of the previous one. But she was only 18, and he was by now 40. But he was so sure that she returned his affections, and he was invited to play at the house, and he ordered new cravats. He sent to for his birth certificate from Bonn. He was going to propose to her. It was all going to be wonderful. Her little dog followed him home, and he was very proud of that. And so he wrote her. She was a not very good pianist also, but there she is. I mean, she also played the guitar, I think. So he wrote her a very easy piece, and he dedicate it to her and present it to her and then propose to her at a party. So he turned up, but the father, whom I think you can see there, was serving a particularly strong punch. And Beethoven drank much too much of this. So I don't know whether he managed to play the piece, but he gave it to her, scribbled on it, and failed to propose. And he made such a scene that the family whisked her off to their country house and forbade him the house again. Well, this piece turned up when she was an old lady in her things after she died. And nobody knew who it was, and so they gave it to a music printer who recognized Beethoven's handwriting. And on it, he had written something a bit splodgily. And so they deciphered it as Für Elise. But it was probably Für Therese. But would you like to talk about the piece, Für Elise?
Well, I mean, it's an extraordinary piece in itself in that it's one of this series of pieces that he writes, which he calls bagatelles. A bagatelle is a mere nothing, something one might throw away, a trifle. And yet, so much of his very important music is in these bagatelles, the early ones and the late ones, and this certainly is part of that. And the idea that he would write this, I suppose what we would call an occasional piece, but a tribute piece, and who knows how he played it or presented. And it's a very interesting piece because it doesn't have a kind of structure that we would normally associate with the time. So it almost feels like a stream of consciousness kind of writing, as do many of his other bagatelles. And this idea that he's not trying to be restrained by the rules, and he's just letting this thing out in a few fragments of ideas, and then gradually they unfold and follow their journey, is a really, really interesting idea. How he might have played it to her is a conundrum we can't begin to imagine.
I mean, that's the story. Again, that story might not be true, but it's, of course, now one of the most famous pieces in the world, and there are lots of ringtones based on it for your mobile phones if you want. Next slide, please. 5 more minutes only. Oh, okay. 5 more minutes only. Oh dear. Well, we've got to the immortal beloved. So we don't know who she was, but I think she was this person, Antonie Brentano, who was married to a friend. And I'll read this passionate thing. Along with the testament about his deafness came this letter to the immortal beloved. And in it he says, "Never can another own my heart. Never, never. Oh God, why have to separate oneself from what one loves? My life in Vienna is a miserable life. Your love makes me at once the happiest and most unhappy. Only through quiet contemplation can we reach our goal, to live together. Be patient. Love me. What longing with tears for you. You, my love, my all. Farewell." It is a very self-contradictory document. Forever yours, forever mine, forever us. Sometimes giving up what you love leads on to everything you wanted in your life. But that doesn't mean it wasn't loss. What remains is an echo, an afterglow from a night with a woman he loves, maybe the only night he ever spent with anyone. A letter from a man who broke down on a midnight dash through a forest. He was warned. He ignored the warning, he always did. A letter he maybe never sent and nobody saw until he died and it was found in a secret drawer. A promise of eternal togetherness. a wishbone about to break, a letter of goodbye. So we haven't, next slide please. Yes, and then that's the letter. Again, another one should never read. Next one please. Then he has, this is the period of going into the end of the road for his heroic period of style. And he goes into a period of complete sort of barrenness, not composing very much important at all. He adopts his brothers, the brothers died, the brother's nephew as his son, and has a really turbulent relationship with him. The boy tries to commit suicide, manages to put 2 bullets in his brain and survive. So he wasn't very good at anything, this, this poor boy. Next slide, please. And this is what Beethoven is looking like now. He's looking old, but he is fermenting his new, extraordinary last music. And I think, and this is one of the things I want to leave with you, that this is a man who has a lot of terrible traumas in his life, but always out of that, he brings the most extraordinary, new, innovative, creative thing. Going back to improvising, he is an eternal creator out of pain into newness. And so I think we have only a few. Yeah?
I've been given a sign that don't rush too much.
Don't rush too much. Yes. Oh, God, you're getting a lot of mysterious signs. Okay. Would you like to comment on the late style?
Oh, golly. I mean, where does one start? This is a javelin thrown into the future that even the generations after are very scared by. What do we do with this late music? But the few pointers that I might be able to give that are useful, it seems to me, on one side, of course, he's now acquired total control of his compositional form. He can pretty much do as he likes. He knows how to take melodies and run with them and work with them. And he seems to have 2, maybe 3 new obsessions in this this style. Firstly, one that I would call songfulness, trying to create fabulous melodic material, whereas before he tended to find driving, energetic material. He's trying to get great beauty of line and song, and we certainly see this a great deal. And in fact, just the sort of the beginning or the lead into this this period, we have what we now call the first ever song cycle, of course, which is a landmark moment. So there we will certainly find a sort of melodic songfulness. The second one to me, now, as you'll know from the Ninth Symphony, he's trying to make all men brothers, and he wants a kind of a different view of the world where, through revolutionary politics, we're all equal rather than rarefied. And what I find in a lot of that music is hints at folk music. Sometimes he pulls in tunes from the streets, a fish seller's cry or something he puts in. There are lots of drones in bass lines that suggest folk kind of musics. And sometimes very compact writing. Again, to say that I'm not just going to expatiate, I'm not going to talk too long, I'm getting to the point. And I think those are the 3 key elements that we can find in all of these. And in fact, a 4th one, a kind of eclecticism we haven't seen in music before. He takes from here, he takes from there. We'll get things that we haven't heard in mainstream music since Bach died. And there are all sorts of elements, references to previous composers that I don't think we've had before. So there's a kind of universalism in this last period.
And if I have time, I'd like to read one which touches on India, because in this period in which he was barren and alone and miserable and having given up love, he is reading around all over the place, and Shakuntala is coming in. I mean, this is a period at which Oriental things are being translated into German, and he's reading from all sorts of things. He even learns the Indian scale. This is the period in which he's keeping a rather mournful journal. India dreams. You are even more alone. Ear trumpets don't help, but you pretend they do. Glass filled with the moon's dry wine, your shadow soft on the ceiling, a moment when every silence in the world conspires with every other. You write out notes of the Indian scale, read Hindu mystics and Shakuntala, Copy the advice given to a faithful wife searching for a husband cursed to forget her on how to endure. On your journey through this earth, your path will be now high, now low. The traces of your feet will be uneven. Virtue will drive you on. Giving up on Eros and his blindness, you cleave to Brahma, the one bright eye, a single coin of light opening in the dark of pagodas you picture on mountain peaks in India. What we forget makes us who we are. Most of our life vanishes in the swirls of the brain's mysterious mirror, but you can't stop looking back at scarlet pearls strewn through the desert, footprints of blood, your journey away from love. So this period went on, and meanwhile he was writing some of his most famous compositions, the choral symphony, the Ninth Symphony, the Missa Solemnis, and the late string quartets. And I'm a viola player, I'm a string quartet player, so my book is very, very much about strings. And it was, they are sort of extraordinary, these things. But Karl is a pianist, and Beethoven, although he played string quartets, was a pianist too, and it was always led by the improvising on the piano. And would you like to just say a little bit about the late piano sonatas? Because it was in these that he broke through into his last glorious, painful style.
Yeah, absolutely. In this last piano style, he seems to find ways to become more ethereal at the piano, whether they're long trills at the top or little patterns that keep repeating. We somehow try and get rid of the substance, if you like, of the instrument in order to get to some kind of higher realm. And then equally to find something, perhaps a fugue, which relates back to Bach's music of 70 years previously, to really anchor and ground it in order to balance that. And I think that's the extraordinary thing about this late pianism. And still today, some of the pianism, particularly of the Hammerklavier sonata, is considered to be one of the most difficult things that a pianist can ever play. So he's absolutely thrown the challenge for 200 years after his death. Can you play this?
Okay, this is the last slide of the last poem. Okay, so this is, I think this is where he died. He was only 56, and I think I'll just read the last poem because he did ask for an autopsy to be done to see why he went deaf, and he didn't really tell us anything. But I wanted to give you this sense of the joy. Although gloomy, Karl has talked about gloom in his music, but every piece in the end has this note of joy at the end. Musica humana. And he said one of the last things he wrote was, I still hope to compose a few great works and then, like an old child, finish my earthly course somewhere among kind people. The auditory canal, covered in glutinous scales, shining throughout the autopsy. The auditory arteries, thick and cartilaginous as if stretched over a raven's quill. And the auditory nerve, withered to a pure white strand. But reading the page in the book of his life on earth, how he joked to the doctor who lanced his belly, gallons of fluid gushing out over the floor. You remind me of Moses striking the rock with his staff. How he laughed when he could. How he read and reread with great joy, he said, a final gift, a 40-volume set of all the works of Handel. And how he died, lifting his fist as if it held a bird he would release into the storm pelting Vienna with snow, like the reckless feathers driving all our lives to seek the fullest experience of the air. I listen to Cello Sonata, Opus 69, and hear the unquenchable spirit that powers every note he writes and lives on, dancing, dancing in you, me, everyone. Sorry to have taken so long.
Since that was such a beautiful session, I'll allow one question. Does anyone have one question? Or should we wrap up? All right.
Thanks a lot, Karl. It was a very great session, and Ruth too, to go over the complete biography of Beethoven. My question is, will we have more such works on other composers as well of the classical era? Let's say.
Well, it is a very interesting question, that, because actually when I started this, I was going to do it on, it was going to be a book called The Divine Spark, and it was going to be about Beethoven and Schubert, because Schubert had an even more tragic life and wasn't famous during his life in the same way at all. But Beethoven did see some of his work and is supposed to have said, this man has the divine spark. But when I got to Bonn, and when I got to all the material on Beethoven, I realized I couldn't possibly fit Schubert into this. So I want to write a novel about Schubert.